A young employee is ruthlessly fired after revealing that she is pregnant by the most powerful man in the company. "You have no place here anymore. Go away and forget we ever met," he says without remorse. What he didn't expect? She is about to rewrite her destiny, and his too. How will he react when the child he abandoned shows up at his company years later? The outcome of this story will leave you speechless. But before we dive into this thrilling story, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss a single detail of this intriguing plot. Henry Sullivan, a man used to having everything under control, was unprepared for the moment Clara Dawson stepped into his office with life-altering news. "I'm pregnant, Henry," she said, her voice steady but eyes filled with hope, as if somewhere deep inside, she still believed he'd embrace this unexpected turn. Henry, however, wasn't a man of sentiment. His mind immediately shifted gears, calculating the risks, the implications, the scandal that could ruin his carefully built empire. He stood there, expressionless, while Clara waited for a response that would never come. In an almost robotic manner, he finally spoke. "You can't work here anymore, Clara. It's best if you leave." The coldness of his words shattered the hope that had been hanging by a thread. How does one respond when their entire future is torn away in an instant? Clara was stunned, frozen in place by the weight of his indifference. This was the man she had trusted, the man she thought had feelings for her beyond the confines of the office. But in that moment, it became clear that to Henry, she was nothing more than a complication, one that had to be dealt with swiftly. "Is that it? After everything we've shared, you're just going to throw me away?" she asked, her voice trembling. But Henry didn't even flinch. His eyes, devoid of any trace of empathy, met hers as he delivered the final blow. "You'll receive a severance package. Let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be." The words felt like a knife twisting deeper. Clara knew right then that this wasn't just about losing a job or a relationship. It was about losing her sense of security, her future, and the child growing inside her. As she walked out of the office, her mind was racing. The betrayal stung, but it was the realization that Henry hadn't even hesitated that cut the deepest. There wasn't a single moment of regret in his eyes. The man she thought she knew so well was nothing but a stranger, hiding behind power and wealth. Clara couldn't afford to crumble, though. With her hand instinctively resting on her belly, she whispered to herself, "I'll figure this out. For us." And so, the seeds of determination were planted amidst the wreckage of her trust. But what happens when you're left to fight alone, with no one to turn to? As the days passed after Clara's dismissal, Henry's life carried on without the slightest hiccup. In his world, everything was about appearances and maintaining a flawless reputation. To him, Clara's predicament was a closed chapter, something he'd already wiped clean from his slate. He hadn't lost a night's sleep over her, or the child she carried. In fact, to Henry, the situation was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, the kind of problem that, when handled swiftly, disappeared as if it had never existed. "She'll move on," he told himself. "They always do." His mind was already back to business meetings, mergers, and dinners with influential clients, life as usual. But little did he know, the consequences of his actions would echo far beyond what he could control. Clara, on the other hand, was left to face the harsh reality of Henry's indifference. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, it was the complete lack of remorse. There was no apology, no recognition of what he'd done. How could someone be so heartless? She often asked herself in the quiet moments of the night. Every time she replayed that conversation in her head, she felt the same cold, empty sensation in her chest. Yet, as much as it pained her, she knew she couldn't afford to dwell on it. She had bigger things to worry about. Finding a job while pregnant was proving impossible, and Henry had used his influence to ensure she wouldn't find another position in the industry. It was as if he had erased her from the professional world, just like he had from his life. Despite the crushing weight of his indifference, Clara didn't break. Her spirit, though bruised, remained intact. She clung to the one thing that gave her hope, her unborn child. "He may have thrown me away, but I won't let him destroy me," she whispered in moments of doubt. Clara refused to let Henry define her future or her child's. Every kick she felt from the baby growing inside her reminded her that there was still something worth fighting for. She wasn't going to let Henry's cold indifference be the end of her story. But how do you rise from the ashes when the world seems to be against you? The reality of Clara's situation hit hard and fast. Without a job, without references, and with her name blacklisted in the industry, she found herself in an impossible position. As the weeks turned into months, she knocked on countless doors, applied for endless positions, but the answers were always the same: no opportunities. Henry had made sure she'd be locked out of any professional future, his influence reaching farther than she had ever imagined. Pregnant and alone, Clara was faced with a devastating choice: give up or fight on. And giving up wasn't in her nature. "I may have nothing left, but I still have him," she'd remind herself, her hand resting on her growing belly. It was that glimmer of hope that kept her moving forward. But surviving wasn't easy. Clara had to learn how to make do with almost nothing. Friends that she thought she could count on distanced themselves, afraid of getting caught up in her complicated situation. Doors that once opened for her now remained firmly shut. And yet, through it all, she remained defiant. Every time she looked at her reflection, she saw not defeat, but a woman ready to face whatever came next. "I won't let Henry's cruelty define me," she often whispered, her words filled with quiet determination. Clara found work wherever she could, small, temporary jobs that helped her scrape by, but none were enough to build the future she had once dreamed of. Despite the crushing weight of Henry's betrayal and the harsh consequences he had orchestrated, Clara knew that the storm would eventually pass. There was no room for self-pity. She had to survive, not just for herself, but for the child growing inside her. "We'll make it," she would tell her unborn son, her voice calm but resolute, even on the hardest days. And so, day after day, Clara pushed forward, with the knowledge that every struggle she faced now would one day give way to something greater. But what happens when the child you raise carries a destiny you never could have predicted? Clara's life changed forever the day Ethan was born. From the moment she held him in her arms, all the pain and hardship seemed to fade, if only for a moment. She knew this child was her second chance, her reason to keep going. Every sleepless night, every moment of doubt was worth it when she saw his bright eyes looking up at her. As the years went by, Ethan became her world, and she poured every bit of love and strength she had into raising him. Even though they had little, Clara made sure that Ethan never felt the weight of their struggles. "We're a team, you and me," she'd always say, kissing his forehead before tucking him in at night. And Ethan, full of wonder and curiosity, never knew the truth of the man who had cast them aside. Ethan grew up surrounded by Clara's unwavering love, never knowing the struggles she faced behind closed doors. While Clara worked multiple jobs just to keep food on the table, Ethan excelled in school, driven by the quiet strength he saw in his mother. "Mom, one day I'm going to take care of you," he'd tell her with such conviction, and Clara would smile, her heart swelling with pride. She never let on how hard things really were. She kept the truth about his father locked away, believing that one day the right time would come to tell him. But for now, she focused on giving Ethan the best life she could, knowing deep down that his future was brighter than the darkness they'd both endured. Despite all the love and care, though, there was a shadow that loomed over their lives: the secret of Henry Sullivan. Every time Clara looked at Ethan, she saw pieces of Henry in him. His drive, his sharp mind, even the way he held himself sometimes. It was all too familiar. But she never let it slip, never let Ethan see the weight of that secret. As he grew older, his curiosity about his absent father naturally grew too. "Who was he, Mom?" he asked once, but Clara simply replied, "He wasn't someone you need to worry about." Little did either of them know, The answer to that question would one day collide with their lives in ways they couldn't even imagine. But what happens when the past you've hidden from your child shows up right at their doorstep? Years passed, and Ethan grew into a remarkable young man, embodying the strength and resilience Clara had instilled in him. Academically gifted and fiercely determined, he worked his way through school, never forgetting his promise to his mother. "I'm going to make you proud, Mom," he'd say, the fire in his eyes undeniable. Clara watched in awe as Ethan's talent and ambition carried him further than she had ever dared to hope. He received scholarships, excelled in his studies, and eventually landed a prestigious job at one of the top companies in the country, Sullivan Enterprises. Little did he know, the name of the company he had admired for so long was tied to the man who had once shattered his mother's life. On his first day at Sullivan Enterprises, Ethan felt a surge of excitement and pride. This was his chance to prove himself, to build a career that would make everything his mother had sacrificed worth it. He was quickly noticed for his sharp intellect and determination, impressing his supervisors and colleagues alike. "This kid's going places," they'd say, watching him navigate the corporate world with ease. But what Ethan didn't realize was that his every move was being observed by the one person who should have recognized him from the very beginning: Henry Sullivan. The powerful CEO saw something in Ethan that reminded him of himself, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. There was an unsettling sense of familiarity that made Henry pause, but he brushed it off. For now. As Ethan climbed the ranks, Clara couldn't help but feel a deep sense of irony. Her son was working at the very company run by the man who had destroyed her life. She had kept the secret for so long, but now, as Ethan thrived in the world Henry had built, Clara knew that the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. She watched from the sidelines, torn between pride in her son's accomplishments and the painful memories of her past. But how long can a mother keep such a life-altering secret, especially when the two worlds are about to collide? It didn't take long for Ethan to catch Henry Sullivan's attention. The young man's drive, intelligence, and unshakable work ethic reminded Henry of himself in his early days, back when ambition was all that mattered. During a company-wide meeting, Henry's eyes fixated on Ethan. Something in his posture, his confidence, it all felt eerily familiar. Henry couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen this young man somewhere before, though he dismissed it as just a trick of the mind. After all, Sullivan Enterprises was a massive company, and Ethan was just another talented newcomer. Or so Henry thought. Ethan, on the other hand, had no idea of the significance of this growing attention. To him, Henry Sullivan was just the powerful CEO he'd always admired from afar, a symbol of success that he aspired to emulate. He threw himself into his work, unaware of the invisible threads connecting their lives. "You've got potential, kid. Keep it up," one of the senior executives said, patting him on the back. But beneath the surface, something much larger was brewing. Clara, watching from the sidelines, began to feel a sinking dread as she realized the time was approaching when she could no longer keep the truth from Ethan. Meanwhile, Henry couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that there was more to Ethan than met the eye. His every move, every word, sparked a sense of recognition that Henry couldn't place. Late one night, as Henry looked over Ethan's employee file, he noticed something: Ethan's birth date. The calculations flooded his mind. Could it be possible? Henry's heart raced, but he pushed the thought away. It wasn't possible, was it? But what happens when the truth you've hidden for years begins to surface, inch by inch, pulling you toward an inevitable collision? The moment Clara had dreaded for so long finally arrived. She couldn't ignore it any longer. Ethan was rising through the ranks at Sullivan Enterprises, and the day of reckoning was drawing closer. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Clara knew it was time. "Ethan," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "there's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago." Ethan looked up from his plate, puzzled by the serious tone in her voice. "What is it, Mom?" he asked, sensing the weight of her words. Clara took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Henry Sullivan, he's your father. For a moment, the room was silent. Ethan blinked, processing the information that had just shattered the foundation of his life. Wait, what? Henry Sullivan? The Henry Sullivan? He stammered, disbelief washing over him. Clara nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. She explained everything: how Henry had abandoned her when she was pregnant, how he had blacklisted her and destroyed her career, and how she had fought, alone, to raise Ethan without him ever knowing the truth. I wanted to protect you from the kind of man he is, she said, her voice cracking. I didn't want his cruelty to touch your life. Ethan was speechless, his mind reeling. The man he had looked up to, the CEO he had admired, was the same man who had abandoned his mother and left them to fend for themselves. Rage, confusion, and heartbreak swirled within him. I've been working for him, all this time, he whispered, as the pieces of his life suddenly fell into place. I've been trying to prove myself to him, and he's the reason we struggled for so long. Clara reached for his hand, her eyes pleading for understanding. I'm sorry, Ethan. I didn't know how to tell you before, but now you need to know the truth. But what do you do when the truth shatters everything you thought you knew? The tension was unbearable as Ethan walked into the lavish restaurant where Henry Sullivan was hosting a dinner for some of his most important business associates. Ethan had made his decision. This was the moment. He was going to confront the man who had destroyed his mother's life, the man who had unknowingly been a part of his own. The room was filled with the clinking of glasses, the hum of quiet conversations, but none of that registered with Ethan as he locked eyes on Henry, sitting at the head of the table, laughing as if nothing in the world could touch him. But tonight, that would change. Mr. Sullivan! Ethan's voice cut through the air, causing heads to turn. Henry glanced up, surprised to see the young, promising employee interrupting such an important dinner. Ethan, this isn't the time, Henry began, but Ethan wasn't there for formalities. I need to speak with you, now, Ethan said, his tone unyielding. Henry, sensing something serious, gestured for the room to quiet down. All right, let's step outside, Henry suggested, but Ethan wasn't interested in keeping things private. Number right here. Everyone needs to hear this, he said, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and betrayal. Henry's smile faded as Ethan began to speak. You don't remember, do you? You don't remember Clara Dawson, do you? The name made Henry freeze, his eyes narrowing as the pieces started to fall into place. She's my mother. You left her when she was pregnant. You ruined her life. And now, I've spent my whole career trying to impress the man who abandoned us. The room was deathly silent. The shocked faces of Henry's family and business partners stared in disbelief as Ethan laid bare the truth. Henry, for once in his life, was speechless. The carefully crafted facade he had built over decades began to crumble right there at the dinner table. But when the truth comes out, what happens next can change everything. The fallout from that fateful dinner was swift and unforgiving. Word of Henry Sullivan's betrayal spread like wildfire, both within his company and throughout the business world. The once untouchable CEO now faced a storm of scrutiny, as investors, board members, and the public all demanded answers. With his reputation in tatters and no way to undo the damage, Henry had no choice but to resign from Sullivan Enterprises. For the first time in his life, he was no longer in control. Ethan, meanwhile, stood at a crossroads. The power he held over his father's legacy was undeniable, but the emotional cost weighed heavily on him. Clara, having watched from the sidelines as the man who had caused her so much pain was finally brought down, felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. She hadn't wanted revenge for herself, only justice for her son. Now that it had arrived, the question remained, what would Ethan do next? You have the power to decide what happens now, Ethan, she said quietly one evening. You can walk away from all of this, or you can take control. But whatever you choose, know that I'm proud of you. Ethan nodded, the weight of the decision resting on his shoulders. It wasn't just about avenging his mother anymore. It was about choosing the path forward, for himself. As Ethan stood outside Sullivan Enterprises, staring up at the towering building that once symbolized everything he aspired to be, he realized something. His future wasn't tied to his father's mistakes. "I'm not him," Ethan whispered to himself. With a deep breath, he made his choice. Not one of vengeance, but one of growth. He would forge his own path, free from the shadow of Henry Sullivan. And as he walked away, he knew that sometimes justice isn't about punishment. It's about freedom. Moral of the story. This story leaves us with an important question. What would you do if your entire life was built on a lie? Ethan's journey teaches us that sometimes the greatest justice isn't found in revenge, but in reclaiming your own path. It's a powerful reminder that we don't have to be defined by the mistakes of those who came before us. As you reflect on this story, think about the people in your life. Are there unresolved truths or hidden scars that need to be addressed? Sometimes, confronting the past is the only way to move forward. But what would you choose? Comment below and share your thoughts. How would you handle discovering such a painful truth? And if you're curious to see more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss out on the lessons and twists that life can throw at us. Stay tuned, because the next story will have you on the edge of your seat.